So we're in the question of differential information or uncertain information. We're in boundary cases, and we talked about the woman or the man whose spouse goes across the water somewhere foreign. News comes back that they're deceased, but they're not deceased. So we're not sure about the status of the husband and the wife. And now, as we enter the 6th Mishnah of the 10th chapter, we're going to get into questions about the status of one of the brothers. What is the status of a brother who's underage? Who's, in other words, who's not of age of majority? And of course, in order to carry out a legal act, and of course, an act of marriage or of yibum is a legal act. In order to carry out a legal act, someone has to be the age of majority. But we've already learned that in the case of yibum, in the case of levirate marriage, the levirate marriage is finalized when the marriage is consummated. So while, in a preliminary sense, that the brother-in-law makes what the Mishnah calls a ma'amar, he makes an agreement, a betrothal to marry his sister-in-law. That is only provisional. And it's only when he has intercourse with his sister-in-law that the yibum is or of course, unless she carries out chalitza, it's only via chalitza or intercourse that the yibum is finally closed off. So what is the status of someone who's underage, who might be physically capable of intercourse, but doesn't have legal capacity? And the Mishnah is going to jump in now. Ben Teisha shanim v'yom echad hu posel al yedei achen ve'achen poslin alav ela shehu posel tchila ve'achin poslin tchila v'sof. A boy of the age of 9 years and 1 day disqualifies posel al yedei achen. This means he disqualifies his sister-in-law from his brothers. So remember, we've always said that if there are multiple brothers who can perform yibum, the first one to carry out yibum essentially carries out the mitzvah. And you can't marry your brother's wife. The mitzvah of levirate marriage, of yibum, is an exception. So once one of the brothers has carried out that task, all the other brothers are forbidden from doing so. It's one of these weird mitzvot where we are either mandated or we're forbidden. There's nowhere in the middle. There's nowhere in the middle. So this boy, Ben Teisha shanim v'yom echad, hu posel al yedei achen, this boy of 9 years old, it seems that his sexual act is sufficient to invalidate his brothers from being able to carry out yibum. Ve'achen poslin al yado. Actually, this should be alav, but the end of the alav, the yud vav, is missing in the manuscript. And his brothers disqualify her from him. In other words, if they carry out yibum, he can't. But there's going to be a but. Ela shehu posel tchila ve'achin poslin tchila v'sof. But he disqualifies them from the outset only, and the brothers disqualify from the outset to the end. And we don't really know what that means. And the Mishnah is going to ask, Kate Sud, how does it work? But we've seen this before. It's a literary technique that is particularly common in the Mishnah of Yevamot. The Mishnah of the Yevamot seems to, it's a very unusual Mishnah, right? It claims to be talking about Yevamot, but it's really a blueprint for the boundaries of marriage. And of course, what we're defining here are the boundaries of, whether a boy who's 9 years and 1 day can get married. We are defining the boundaries of marriage here. But we've seen before that the Mishnah of Yevamot likes to articulate some kind of general principle, which we don't understand. Maybe it's useful as a mnemonic for those learning the Mishnah in the Beit Midrash. It articulates this general principle, which we don't understand, and then it tries to flesh it out by giving examples. So rather than, if you like, spending too much time on the principle, which we're not going to understand, let's just go through the examples, and then as we go through the examples, we should understand what is going on here, and we'll understand the underlying principles at a more fundamental level than the mnemonic phraseology in which the Mishnah has articulated it. So let's pursue the Ketzad. Ketzad, how does it work? How does it work? Let's have some real example now. If a boy of 9 years and 1 day had intercourse with his Yevamot, so in other words, his brother has died, his sister-in-law is potentially attached to him as a Yevamah, he has intercourse with her. If that happens, ufasal al yedei achim, he disqualifies her from his brothers. Once he's performed that act, his brothers can't get involved. They're now forbidden rather than commanded. But Ba'u aleha achim ve'asu v'ma'amar ve'natnu get or chaltzu paslu al yadav. If his brothers did this, if his brothers had intercourse with her, or if they did ma'amar, if they performed a rabbinic betrothal, or if they gave her a get, or if they submitted to her chalitza, if she performed the ritual of chalitza, thereby exempting herself completely from yibum, paslu al yadav, they disqualify her from him. So in other words, it seems as though these acts which require intention, in other words, giving a ma'amar, or giving a get, or giving chalitza, these acts which require intention require someone of majority. But it seems somehow that the kind of the act of sexual intercourse doesn't require intention. And the Gemara tries to explain it. If we're going to have a look, let's look at the Gemara in Yevamot. We're in the Jerusalem Talmud. Shmuel Amar Divrei Rabbi Meir. Shmuel says in the name of Rabbi Meir, Asu biat ben tesha shanim v'yom echad k'ma'amar bagadol. They made the intercourse of a child of 9 years and 1 day like the ma'amar of an adult. Now that's really interesting. So we've learned that it's really yibum and chalitza that are the definitive acts, either intercourse or chalitza, effectively crystallize or dissolve the bounds of yibum. The ma'amar is a sort of rabbinic betrothal. It's put in place because the rabbis really don't like the idea of sealing a legal contract via sexual intercourse. So they put this ma'amar in place in between. But it's a rabbinic act. If you give a woman ma'amar, then she has to be released with a get. If you do this to 2 women, then maybe your brother had 2 wives, you give them both ma'amar. We've learned already you have to give them both a get. So it's a rabbinic enactment. We're saying that the intercourse of a child of 9 years and 1 is a bit like the ma'amar of an adult. It has some force, but it doesn't have full legal force. And the Gemara is going to ask why. And why did they make the intercourse of a child of 9 years and 1 day like the ma'amar of an adult? Sheken biyah v'gadol koneh bein ladat bein shelo ladat. Because the intercourse of an adult acquires whether intentional or not intentional. And we've learned this already, by the way, that back in the 6th chapter of Yevamot, we learned that the sexual relationship between the Yabam and the Yevamah, between the brother-in-law and the widow of the deceased brother, that has legal force, whether it's accidental or intentional. It's a very odd Mishnah. We learned it in the 6th chapter, whether accidental or intentional, that act has legal force. And I guess that the Gemara here is saying is, look, because that act has legal force, regardless of intent, someone who's a minor and who doesn't have legal capacity for intent can still carry it out. I think that's what the Mishnah is saying. And then the Mishnah is going to give other examples that sort of flesh the position out. So let's just carry on down the Mishnah, because we're really still in the Ketzad. How does it work? So let's say a boy of 9 years and one day had intercourse with his Yevamah. And then his brother, who was of the age of 9 years and 1 day. So he's got a brother who's also a minor. And he had intercourse with her. I mean, if she's a widow, I mean, she has a connection of Yibum possibly to both brothers. Pasal al Yadav, the second intercourse makes Pasul the first one. In other words, she disqualifies her. So this is like the situation of two ma'amars. We learned actually in the Mishnah of Yevamot in the 5th chapter. Asa ma'amar bazo u'ma'amar bazo tzrichot shnei gitin v'chalitza. If someone did ma'amar with 2 women, they need gitin and chalitza. So the ma'amar is strong enough, if you like, to require a get to dissolve it, but it's not strong enough to ensure that the first ma'amar disqualifies the second. If a ma'amar were definitive, then the first one will be conclusive and the second would have no meaning at all. And similarly with the act of intercourse, if the sexual relationship of the 9-year-old in 1 day was definitive, then what his brother did the next day would have no meaning, at all, because he's already completed the Yibum. But the Mishnah here is saying, if the Mishnah is saying, look, if a boy has intercourse with his Yivamah 1 day, and then his brother has intercourse with her the next day, and his brother disqualifies her from him, that the Mishnah is essentially saying, look, neither of these acts are definitive. So there is something about the sexual act which somehow transcends intent, but it doesn't quite work. It's not quite definitive without intent. In order for closure, we need a Yabam who is an adult. And I think that maybe that's the best way of explaining this conundrum that the Mishnah gave us. He disqualifies his brothers, and his brothers disqualify from him. But he kind of makes an initial disqualification. The brothers, i.e. the adult brothers, disqualify from the beginning to the end. In other words, they make the definitive act. And someone who's under the age of majority can't make the definitive act. And by the way, Rabbi Shimon's going to object. So we have this ambiguous situation of the 2 brothers, and Rabbi Shimon Omer lo fasal. Rabbi Shimon says, no, it doesn't work like that. Rabbi Shimon seems to be unsure as to whether the sexual act of a 9-year-old has any meaning at all. But of course, if it does have meaning, then then she's married to the first brother. And if it doesn't have meaning, well, if it doesn't have meaning, then neither act of neither of the brothers have any meaning at all, and she's not disqualified. So Rabbi Shimon, if you like, has a black and white view, whereas the halakha seems to view it more in gray. The halakha seems to say that the sexual act of someone who's below the age of majority, it has some impact, but that impact is not definitive.